Hello and welcome back to another episode of Taking Control of Cancer, the podcast brought to you by the North East London Cancer Alliance. I'm Steve Bland, and in this podcast we try and give you a bit of a how-to guide to help you overcome common myths, fears and barriers to cancer prevention, diagnosis, treatment and care. We want to give both patients and healthcare professionals tangible things that they and you can do to help when it comes to cancer. Because while we know that not all cancers are preventable, there are things that we can all do that can make a really positive difference to the health and well-being of ourselves, our family, our friends and our colleagues. And actually, talking of colleagues, this one is a really interesting episode because we're talking about returning to work after cancer, all issues around that, navigating conversations, confidence, change for both employees and employers. There are so many things that we can get into here. I'm joined by Mark Geimer, who's the CEO of the charity Cancer Support UK, to explore what going back to work really looks like after a cancer diagnosis and how both employees and employers can help make the process healthier, kinder and more successful. I'm also joined by podcast veteran Sarita Yuganti from the North East London Cancer Alliance. So without further ado, let's get cracking. So thank you so much, Sarita and Mark, for joining me. It's a really interesting topic, this, and I think one that will resonate with an awful lot of people. You hear so many stories, don't you, about people going back to work, both during their treatment and afterwards, I think, as well, is an important one to get into. Mark, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the charity and how it was formed, what you guys do, and how you help people in this area?
Yeah, good afternoon, Steve, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk about, as you say, this really important topic. Cancer Support UK is it's a national charity. It's been around for over 20 years, but I would say in the last sort of 8 years, it's been through a bit of a reinvention as a charity, where we've looked at the landscape as a whole and tried to really identify where there are some key areas that need some additional support, where maybe there's a lack of service. So we focus on three key areas really, which is all tied to providing emotional and practical support, and those are provision of cancer kits for people who have had a cancer diagnosis, providing emotional support to people who have completed their physical treatment. And the third one, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about more today, is training employers around the topic of cancer and how to be more supportive, especially around communication when it comes to dealing with people who have been impacted by cancer.
That's so interesting, isn't it? I think when you started 20 years ago, I imagine, quite understandably, a lot of focus was always on the actual treatment for the cancer, wasn't it? And I think it's only really, I've kind of been involved in cancer world, for 10 years maybe, and even in that 10 years, we're talking way more than we were about the other stuff, which is really important, but it is the other stuff around the treatment, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I heard your podcast about the new cancer plan, for example, and that really started to highlight how we have to think about cancer more holistically. And we're absolutely supportive and recognise the need to make sure that we diagnose more people, diagnose them quicker, treat them as soon as you can and as effectively as you can. But as a charity, we fundamentally believe that if you're not supporting people through the entire journey, which goes beyond the physical treatment, you're not actually creating the best possible support for people. And there is an impact of that. And I think, people are starting to realise that there's a real cost. If people finish their treatment and then find that they're really struggling, at some point, and it can happen quite a long time after you finish the physical treatment, that you start to struggle emotionally, or you're just not clear on how to sort of find a way forwards, as people often describe it, then there's a real cost of that, and they could come back into the healthcare system. They often do, and that's a burden for already a very stretched NHS service. Local doctors, trying to get appointments, etc. So if we're able to deliver services that can reduce that impact, it benefits the whole healthcare system, which is something that I think people, and certainly in that 10-year plan, we're starting to feel that people are starting to understand that a bit more.
So Rita, we talked in a previous episode, and while Mark was talking, I was trying to think what the topic was, but we talked, didn't we, with a guest about employers having actual proper cancer policies, and I think it's something that probably we're quite a way off. A lot of them having, but I think it's something that would be really useful for a lot of employers.
I think so too, and supporting. I mean, what Mark, you were saying about the focus on holistic needs and the holistic well-being of patients and those around them, especially like their carers, is starting to really get that momentum, because I've been working in this field now for, I don't know how long, I'd like to say for about 7-8 years, and it's always been an uphill struggle. It's always trying to raise that priority in the portfolio. What does holistic care mean? Why does it matter? And because people are surviving longer, we're actually hearing their stories a lot more. So we've got a bit more of a collection of different stories showing and evidencing why that holistic management is so important. But going back to work and, the work, family, friends, life, it's all very much something that surrounds a cancer patient. And that life of the cancer patient should also be taken into consideration by all of the healthcare professionals around that patient.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I think also from my point of view, I was the other half. I was the husband of somebody with cancer, and I think back to, this is going back about 10 years, and I think back at the time I worked for a very small PR agency, 4 or 5 people maybe. And it was they were really supportive of me, but it was really difficult for them to give me time off. And I think it's there's so much here, isn't there? So many issues, so many different challenges for the different people, the different parts of this whole story.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you've touched upon there is what we would describe as an organisation needing to consider reasonable adjustments for people who have been directly impacted by cancer. But what you've described is somebody who's definitely impacted by cancer, but may not have the same level of rights and protection. The reason it's such an important topic, if you look at the numbers broadly involved, we have a working population in the UK, an adult working population of about 36 million people. They estimate that there's around about 800,000 people of working age who have had a cancer diagnosis directly. So these are people who could well be in the workplace now. But the people who are supporting a loved one who's had a cancer diagnosis is about another 1.1 million people. So you're talking about almost 6% of the entire working population in the UK have been pretty directly impacted by cancer today.
An awful lot of people.
It's an awful lot of people. So it's in everyone's interests to actually take a fresh look at this and sort of go, okay, well, there's some legal obligations, because if you have a cancer diagnosis, you're protected by the Equality Act of 2010, as you probably talked about this previously, I'm sure. But, that kind of is really just the highest level of, what an organisation, or the minimal, I would say, amount that an organisation needs to consider. Once you start looking at, okay, so what reasonable adjustments do I need to put in place for the individual, there's a lot of grey area there. And you talk about a small organisation with 5 people. Well, if somebody is going to be absent from that organisation a lot, clearly it has a massive impact on that organisation.
Yeah.
So it's great if they have the resources, the financial depth and the culture to support you, but many, genuinely will find that very difficult. And so there's that whole discussion then about, okay, so what is, a reasonable amount of adjustment that we should be making, and how do we do that?
It's so interesting. I can remember I was really desperate to, because I understood their situation. I would go into hospital with Rachel and I would say, right, I can work I can work from the hospital, and you get your laptop out, and then there's a, somebody comes in, but saying this, and then the next person comes in, and there's a test to go off for, and there's all different things, and by the time you leave, absolutely goosed after a day in hospital. You've maybe done half an hour of actual work, and I can remember feeling they were so supportive of me, but I can remember thinking this is really like unfair on them, because I'm supposed to be doing something, and if I don't do it, it kind of lets the team down. But there are a lot of people affected by this. Mark, do you want to just tell me some of the the common fears or the worries that people living with cancer have in this area?
Yeah, we know from people's lived experience, their own stories, that there's lots of, firstly, again, as most people would recognise, everybody is different. So we've got to be a little bit careful around generalisations. But there are some common themes, as you suggest. So one of those is a common misconception that, immediately people are going to think, well, I've had a cancer diagnosis, they're going to assume I can't do my job. That's kind of like one of the really common things that we hear. And it doesn't matter how confident you are, how experienced, how capable, it's a thought that almost is impossible to sort of not have at some point. So, that's kind of one of the challenges, is that instantly people may sort of start trying to think about, okay, so do I even tell my employer that I've had a cancer diagnosis?
Do you find that plenty don't?
Lots of people don't tell their employer, and even to the extent where they will use holiday to go to appointments, which is just, to us is incredible, but it happens a lot. And they sort of almost choose to do that because they think they can kind of keep it, under the radar, as it were, and that protects their work. So, that's sort of one extreme of it. Another might be that and this is an area where we do a lot of work, it's about how people react when you say you've had a cancer diagnosis, or if people know you've had a cancer diagnosis, how they behave differently. So one of the services I mentioned that we do is actually about providing people some emotional support after they've had their physical treatment. And one of the themes that kept coming up again and again was the challenge of returning to work. So, I've had my treatment, I've had the all clear physically, and I want to get back to work. And this can be really, really challenging. So you obviously have the potential physical side effects that can affect you. So you might be feeling fatigued and other potential issues. But it's the psychological challenges and the emotional challenges which actually come up again and again as bigger challenges. So one story, I'll never forget this, was somebody saying that they returned to work, and somebody they'd worked with for many, many years, they kind of really saw them as a friend. And they said, what was really difficult was that they knew that they were avoiding them. So when it came to lunchtime, they didn't join them for lunch, whereas previously they always would. Really, really difficult, for that individual, because as we know, people who have a cancer diagnosis talk a lot about feeling lonely, feeling isolated, and this will only accentuate that feeling. And what we came to realise as we looked into this more and more was that it was less actually about the company's policies. It was about people's individual understanding about cancer, but how to communicate to someone who's been impacted by cancer, whether it's direct or indirect. And that's where we've started to focus, because that's where we believe we can have the most impact. And so we go into organisations and we talk to them and train them around, what happens if one of your colleagues or someone does have a cancer diagnosis.
How to talk to somebody with cancer.
How to talk to somebody. And, again, if you're in this space, you will know this, or if you've had experience, you will know this. Everyone's different. There's not a set playbook. And you can't say this, do that.
I've been asked 100 times, what to say and how to help. How to help's a funny one, because there's not a great deal you can do to help in a lot of circumstances. I just always say to say something rather than nothing, because in my experience, when I
was going through it with Rachel, the people I really struggled with were the ones that went completely silent.
Yes.
I'd just rather you made a joke about it, or just you did something, just like were visible and there.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't know what to say, and that's another topic, Sarita, isn't it? Because we, a big battle in lots of different areas of the alliance's work, be it all the inequalities you're working with, is actually just getting people able to talk about these things.
Absolutely. Like, there's still a lot of taboo, isn't there?
Yeah.
I'm a trustee on Cancer Support UK, and one of the coaching sessions that I joined, I do remember again another person talking about their experience going back, and it was on the subject of the new normal. So they're on their journey of their new normal. They know that it's not going to be how it was before, and the first thing that people say to them, "Oh, you look all right," and inside they feel fatigued, as you said, Mark, or feel really awful, or conscious that they look different. And when they're trying to adjust to this new normal, to have flippant comments, and it's probably meant in the nicest way, "Oh, you look all right, I thought you might look worse," but still is that emphasis on what you look like. And I think when you're returning back to kind of the workplace where previously everyone knew you pre-cancer, and you return back, and then all of a sudden people do kind of change a little bit, and they might be making reasonable adjustments themselves, but actually it should be the person that's gone through the treatment to be able to.
They're trying the hardest in a lot of cases, aren't they?
Yeah, but they should say what the regional adjustment should be. So whether it's to attend follow-up appointments or a support group, psychological support is so important. And if more employers kind of realised or acknowledged that actually time and space to allow that patient or person to kind of get back to the level that they're trying to achieve, not what they were before, but
Your work colleagues are in a funny place, and sometimes, aren't they? Because I had this argument with my wife at home. Sometimes I often someone's a friend if I met them a couple of times, but your work colleagues kind of sit a little bit in between your actual friends in some cases, don't they? So so you.
Not quite family, not quite friends, but you didn't choose them.
You're not always at the level where you want to tell them everything. They're not always close enough to be that person, are they? And I think it must be really difficult for them as well, if they've not perhaps had experience themselves of dealing with something like this.
Yeah, and I think that, again, is what we've discovered, is that companies are getting better. There's been a big movement around well-being, and since the pandemic, a huge amount of investment by organisations recognising that they have to invest in their employees' well-being. So I think the mistake that we see is that organisations think they only have to focus on the individual impacted.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about here is that there's a lot of other people who are struggling with this situation. Okay, they haven't been directly involved and they haven't had to deal with the challenges of cancer, but the reality, the reason they avoid or they're quiet because they don't know what to say is the stigma around cancer. So, the word often people will just think the worst thing. They don't really understand. It's a complicated area. There's lots of different versions, as we know, and lots of different outcomes for everyone. So, why would people understand all of that?
Yeah.
It makes sense that they wouldn't. But what we found is that if you can give people a basic level of knowledge, it's interesting how their confidence goes from here to here to go and engage with someone and have a conversation.
Just ask questions, isn't it?
Asking questions,
The confidence is a really good word, isn't it? Have the confidence to, to know that, you might say the wrong thing in air quotes, but I just always found, to me, there wasn't really a wrong thing. You'd have to be really wrong to say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I just wanted people to say something. It is a challenging area for employers, though. I know. Yeah. There are lots of difficulties we touched on before about, a small business, 4 or 5 people. Maybe you work with a lot of contractors or freelancers. There are loads of issues for employers. What are some of the ones that you come across?
Yeah, I think how to actually make sure that those individuals feel supported. I think companies have many reasons to think about that. So we often talk about a company's sort of brand around culture, and that's increasingly important for a number of reasons. So a business is there to make money. That's why they exist in the first place. If you have a culture within an organisation where people don't feel psychologically safe, secure, they will leave. You know, it's a competitive world out there. And the cost for a company, if you lose an employee and you have to replace them, you can generally say about a third of their annual salary is the cost to replace them. Mm-hmm. So they actually have a business incentive to make sure these people feel supported. But what we've talked about is that other people that you employ are also feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So what if I'm in a situation where I've known someone for 20 years and I'm just really struggling to know how to have the conversations with them because no one's come to me and said, look, we'll give you a bit of information, a bit of support, just so that you can feel like you're doing the right things. I may decide that I'll go and work for someone else. It would just be easier.
Yeah.
And so you suddenly have further issues. So I think some organisations are recognising, you know, we work with global brands who employ thousands of people, but we also work with the smaller companies who might only have 10 or 20. But typically, we're only working with, you know, a tiny fraction of who we should be working with. You know, this is something that would benefit everyone. So I think there is a bit of a, you know, a challenge because they do have to, you know, it is tough for the employers because you do have to make sure you cover all your legal obligations.
Yeah.
You know, people are employed to make sure that happens. So you've got to make sure your core policies are in place and that you are making sure that you support people based upon the current legal requirements. The danger is that you stop there because there's so much else to do.
Yeah.
And you don't pick up on all this other stuff that we're talking about, which is a huge missed opportunity.
What is the legal situation then? What do companies legally have to do for somebody with cancer if they're employed?
Yeah, I mean, it's about the reasonable adjustments.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can't discriminate against somebody is the key point. So you can't suddenly say, okay, so because you've had cancer, what we're going to do is we're going to change your role. Because I've discriminated against you because of something that's happened to you, which is protected under Disability Act, so the Equality Act. So I think, you know, there is a certain amount of protection there, but we still will hear stories of people that sort of say, well, you know, that's all well and good, but I sort of feel like I was forced out. Things changed, and it can be the subtle changes, which is the problem. And that's where, you know, there's grey areas, and that's where I think people, you know, find it very, very difficult.
Can I ask a question as well, Mark? It's just normally bad news travels fast. So we hear a lot of stories from patients who've had to leave an employment or an employer because of the way that when they returned to work, it didn't fit for either party, if we leave it at that bit. But good news, so, you know, good example. So through the workplace training, I'm sure that we'll start building what good looks like. And it's about not just the heads of, you know, HR or well-being, it's how do they disseminate the information through their staff as well to, you know, line managers and to other people that would, you know, person coming back to work will be looking to, you know, re-engage with and get back into working life.
It's a really good point, and I think organisations that regard this as an active programme is where we're seeing the success. And so I can name one company because they've published this on social media, so it's in the public domain. So Unilever is a company that we've worked with for a number of years, and they work with other organisations as well because they recognised through their employees that there was a need to provide more support for people impacted by cancer. And they've created a community of people who have done the extra training to get that deeper understanding around things like communication, around increasing awareness, etc. and they have that buddy community that's embedded across their organisation, across all their different sites. And then it's about an active programme. So having, like on World Cancer Day, you say, okay, well, let's activate our community, make sure they're visible, make sure they're talking to all the other members of staff, talking about what we can provide and how we can support them. And they actually fed back, and I remember I think it was the head of wellbeing posted something on social media talking about how after a few years they were really starting to see the benefits of that. So seeing more members of staff kind of come forward and talk about their needs and engaging with them. And if an organisation of that scale can do it, it gives hope that many more organisations.
But it's easier in a way for a big company like that to do it,
have
isn't
resources.
It? They have a HR team, I imagine, that's got hundreds of people in it, and then you go back to the smaller companies, even 10, 20, 50 people, probably have one HR person running ragged with contracts and all the other disputes and all sorts of things, and it's how to fit that into everything else that you're trying to do.
And I think, to be fair to them, they would say, well, actually, when you consider the scale of our operation and how much we have to do, we actually have a very small resource in terms of like a wellbeing team. And the way to do it, whether you're a big or small company, where we've seen success, is how you engage individuals. It's almost like creating a volunteer team within the organisation. You say, well, we understand this, and clearly people have some kind of lived experience are often the ones who put their hands up because they get it. And they kind of like say, well, actually, this is important and I want to be involved in it. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment with Liverpool University. Similar situation where it started with a group of individuals that had identified the need, but based upon the work that we were doing with them, that's escalated so that we're now working with the HR team around an organisation. It's nearly 4,000 staff, so working at an organisational level to say, how do we embed this across the culture of the organisation? So there are, to Sarita's point, there are some really encouraging stories out there, but I'd like there to be a lot more, if I'm honest.
Sarita, I guess it's about whether you've got a big or small company, it's about how important you think this is, isn't it?
Yeah. 1 in 2 of us are going to be affected by cancer, so it is quite a big thing.
I imagine lots of them will have mental health policies. But how many of them will have a cancer policy or a cancer-specific policy? They might have a sickness policy that kind of incorporates cancer a little bit, but whether they have a specific cancer policy, because cancer is probably, I was going to say unique, but it's not unique, but different to a lot of other kind of conditions where you might not have a block off. You might just have the occasional day here and there, and that day might kind of bleed into another day, and then it's quite unpredictable, isn't it? The course of a treatment. It's really difficult to say I'll be off here, and I'll be off here, and I'll be off here.
It's conversely for the carer as well. So if you think about kids that got cancer and their parents are in full-time work, and again, they're not the patient, so to speak, but they're affected by cancer. So again, if we're thinking about the language we're using, we're not just talking about the person or patient with cancer, but those that are affected by cancer. Could be through a loved one, could be through caring for elderly people or younger people, whoever it is that you're caring for. What about their needs? And that just broadens the number of people that need some reasonable adjustments, I think, in their workplace.
What are some of the ways, and again, I don't want to generalise, but what are some of the common ways that cancer can impact, your ability to work? I'm thinking of, our old friend chemo brain. I can remember Rachel, really struggled with it at times, and particularly in and around treatments. You're obviously, you're a lot more tired, a lot of physical impacts. What are some of the ways that cancer actually can genuinely impact your ability to do your work?
I think the physical side is, there's the fatigue piece that you've talked about there. The chemo brain is something that a term that people would be familiar with, the side effects that you get from that particular treatment. There's lots of different drugs that are being used that, these are strong medications, so they will usually come with some kind of side effects. But I think, the physical aspect in a way is a bit more visible. So I think people feel almost more comfortable having conversations around those and dealing with them. Where it gets more difficult is if you're facing the fatigue side. What if you start doubting yourself? So you're suddenly a lot less confident in the job that you do, and that will show itself in the performance. So it gets complicated, right? Because people are saying, well, he's had lots of treatment, it's affecting him physically. But actually, if you can support the emotional side a bit more, you can probably deal with some of those physical aspects a lot better than you would if you're dealing with everything as a complete package.
That's so true. I think the emotional side is so important in lots of different ways, Sarita, isn't it? And I know you guys do loads of work in this area on the physical, the emotional side as well. But I can confidence. I remember Rachel going back in, and all of a sudden, there's a bit more doubt in some of the things that she would have found second nature before, or and it's those things. People think like a financial worry isn't anything compared to your health, but when you lump that on top of something else, on top of something else, on top of something else, you just don't need that, do you? When you're going through something so serious.
And another side is, again, going back to consequences of treatment. If someone had pelvic radiation, incontinence is a big issue. So if you're then expected to travel in and out of work, commuting, that's not just, people would be mortified of being on the tube and then losing control. But it can happen to any of us. And if it's happened because of cancer treatment, you probably might be thinking, very self-conscious. You might be thinking, gosh, everyone around me is seeing what's happening. Or you can't access a public bathroom. I mean, how accessible are public bathrooms nowadays? That's another thing. So it's more than just the workplace. I think as a society, we need to be a bit more sympathetic.
A lot of it is societal, isn't it?
It is,
a lot of this is our ability to talk about cancer, to talk to people about their, what's going on.
You go into a pub and it says for customers only, so, we need to give confidence to people to say, well, I've just had treatment, I need to use your facilities, so.
I've been watching recently a Gordon Ramsay documentary on Netflix, and I was thinking, when you were talking about Gordon Ramsay's kitchen nightmares, when he goes into kitchens and he goes, well, what on earth is going on here with some, more expletives. But do you go into some companies and you go, what on earth is going on here? Obviously, we don't want to start mentioning naming and shaming, but you must go in and go, this is just all wrong.
I think in sort of the way that we're engaging with companies, it's often because they've come to us.
Yeah.
So we're in a position where they've already recognised that they want to do something more.
Yeah.
Where we don't get involved so much is some of the things we're talking around the physical changes and the physical needs. We know that prostate cancer is, affecting a huge number of men every year. Some of those men will be having, major operations that will mean that they need to use the toilet more, and they may have some different requirements after they've had their surgery. So how organisations are set up to cope with these things, I suspect there's awful lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
But again, I think the more we're having the conversation and the more it becomes part of okay to discuss within society, then you sort of think these things are going to start to happen.
Yeah. You mentioned the National Cancer Plan earlier on, and I think one of the big things in that was support for after your treatment finishes and living well with cancer. Is there any support currently available to businesses if like we go back to that that 5 or 10 person business? Is there any support if they can only afford to give a couple of weeks off on full pay or something, or if they can't afford to to not have to backfill if someone's going off every week for their chemotherapy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the reality is there isn't enough support there. I'm sure that's what businesses would say. It comes down back to what the current legal situation is, and it will come down to your employment contract essentially as to how much support the business has committed to give you in terms of sick pay, and then you move on to statutory sick pay thereafter once you've fulfilled the contractual commitment. So there is an element of people who are working potentially for larger companies will have a greater amount of cover. If for example you're taking half days for treatment, that can be covered under your contractual obligations around sick pay, so you can potentially get full sick pay for that. But if for example they say, well, there's 3 months off that we cover for sick pay, then you move on to statutory sick pay, then that's what you move to thereafter, which is obviously a lot less money.
It's the unpredictable nature too, as we said before, isn't it? Sometimes it isn't just, I'm going to have this period off and then I'll be fine. It's that was the thing that I struggled with the most, is all of a sudden Rachel will get an email or a phone call saying you've got to come in tomorrow for this test or whatever it might be, or we've brought your surgery forward or whatever. All of a sudden,
Drop everything.
I've got to drop everything and go with her. And to be fair, they won't be listening, but Gary and Lee in my old agency that I worked for, they were absolutely fantastic. They were absolutely brilliant. But I know it was really difficult for them because, as I said, we only had 4 people, and I look at some places that I'm working with now, and there's a chap that I work with who has got testicular cancer, and he's going through his treatment at the moment, and it's really difficult. So they've had to backfill, bring someone in on a kind of contract basis, and I just think it's so difficult. And it feels like those businesses need more support. Like, it feels like you should, because there are some who it just wouldn't be possible to give full support to someone who's off, either another half or a son or a daughter, or whoever it might be.
Yeah, I think it's important. It's easy to sit here and say this, but people have to, at the earliest possible stage, go and have a conversation with their employer. It's even if you're unsure, which many people are, especially at the early stages of having a diagnosis, as we talked about before, it's so tempting to kind of sit back, and you're focused on other things anyway, so you don't want to go and have deep and meaningful conversations about things that don't seem that important at the time. Yeah. But the sooner you can do that, the sooner you can start talking about, okay, so how are we going to manage this? Because one of the benefits of what's happened in the workplace over the last few years is a huge amount of flexibility has come into the workplace in a way that maybe 6 or 7 years ago we just didn't think was possible. Yeah. And that isn't the case in all jobs and all companies, and we recognise that, but it is possible in so many more than it was previously.
It's so chicken and egg though, isn't it, Sarita? Because if you don't feel like you can go to your boss and explain your situation and talk through the options and talk through that's probably because you know where it's going to go. Yeah. You know that they're not going to be supportive, whereas the people that probably can go to their bosses and explain what's going on, and they're the ones who probably know that they're going to be supported.
There's always going to be unsympathetic bosses, just like there's going to be unsympathetic neighbours or whoever it is. But if they really are struggling, I think the CSUK have kind of spent a lot of time curating the training tool using lived experience. So the only advice really I can give is, if you've got people that are going through or being impacted by cancer, is to seek support. Go to CSUK or talk to your local cancer alliances, because resources are there. So even if it's not going back to this, if it's a small organisation, 4 or 5 people, and they might not be able to give the flexibility is required, but at least with the communication side, making sure that their employees feel valued, number one, because what's happened to them is not because of them. They can't be, I think the word I'm trying to say is disadvantaged or blamed for their position, or, I think just seeking support. There's lots out there.
Yeah. What sort of support then do you give? What are the resources? When you go into a company, what programs do you run them through?
Yeah, so we've sort of, through the work that we do for our cancer coach service, which is aimed at the individuals that require the emotional support, we've developed a lot of expertise with a group of expert coaches who all have their own lived experience. So we've been able to kind of build that insight and that knowledge to kind of really understand what some of these key issues that we think, if you can address them as an organisation, it's going to make a real difference to not only people but to your business. And the I guess there's kind of different ways that we can deliver that. So we sometimes go to organisations that are vast and dispersed, and they say, look, to train every individual in this company, it's going to take years and cost us an enormous amount of money. So one of the ways that we've addressed that, going back to how things have changed in modern technology, is that we can deliver a webinar, which can be delivered via Zoom or Teams, which can be broadcast to the entire organisation wherever they are, can be recorded and put on as a resource for the company to then send around to people who aren't available. And what we found is that even within 1 hour, you can actually create a level of knowledge and understanding that can make a difference. So that's kind of like the first touch point. If for us, if we're going into an organisation and they're unsure, we will often say, well, run this 1 hour webinar, build a bit of knowledge within the organisation, and then see what comes back. And it often starts a conversation, and you might find that suddenly people who are caring for somebody, or somebody who's had a cancer diagnosis at some point in their life, will sort of put their hand up and start talking about that. So suddenly the company becomes much more aware. We then have what I would call a more advanced workshop, where we're specifically working with line managers, because they are an integral part of many organisations in terms of how you support individuals and sort of try to create the right type of cultures. And then we do a sort of even more advanced workshop, which is about 3 hours, which is creating what we call a workplace cancer support ambassador. And that would be the equivalent, I would say, would be the mental health first aiders that are often trained within organisations, similar sort of intensity of training. And that's where you will do a lot more work around scenarios, those one-to-one conversations. So you're really building skill and capability and extra knowledge. And these are often the individuals that will form the basis of these communities that I've talked about, sort of that active volunteer community within an organisation. That what we found is that we need to sort of supplement that with some additional training material. So we have an e-learning module, which Bart's actually has access to for all its staff on their e-learning platform. So it's about 45 minutes. And again, it's kind of the introductory level around how you communicate to someone about cancer. But, we're constantly evolving and learning how to adapt for the needs of the individuals we're trying to support, but also making sure that it has to add value to the organisation. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to engage with them and get them to take this on.
They work on the bottom line, don't they? And I guess the other thing I was thinking when you were talking, reputation is actually really important too. And we're in a era of social media where if someone feels wrong, they're gonna talk about it a lot more. So reputation is, we don't want it to be a driver, because we want people to want to help and want to put these programs and policies in place. But reputation's important, isn't it?
There's a lot more reviewing now of employers. I can't remember which website I looked at, and it kind of says other people that worked at this organisation would rate this place. It's almost like a star rating.
There were loads of that kind of thing. I'm trying to think of the one I'm trying to think of. There's a places to work rating, isn't there?
Yes.
I'm trying to think.
Glassdoor, is it?
Glassdoor. I'm thinking of. And people love to shout about their Glassdoor ratings, but you'd soon get a reputation for 1 in 2 of us going to be affected by cancer. You would soon become known, particularly if you're a bigger company, become known as somewhere where they weren't sympathetic.
And I think, we do have to give organisations some credit. They're not trying to create environments that people don't want to be in. That doesn't serve their purpose. So I think it comes back to the challenge around cancer, actually, which is that it kind of, even though it's all around us and it affects so many people, it still feels like it sits below the surface. If you look at society at large, it's not something that we're potentially talking about at the moment, maybe a bit more because of the 10-year cancer plan. It's in the news a bit more. But, considering how many people it impacts, it's not part of the mainstream conversation. There will be conversations about mental health, and we've moved on over the last 10 years so that is part of the mainstream conversation. But I think we've got a lot of work to do to catch up when it comes to cancer.
Let's do some top tips then. Let's looking at maybe the three groups of people we're talking about. We're talking about I just thought of three, and I'm only thinking of two now. But people with or affected by cancer. Top tips for how they should tackle their situation with their employer. This is what I'm thinking of. The third group. Top tips for people who work with someone who has recently been diagnosed or is post-treatment living with the aftermath. And then for the bosses, the employers, top tips for those three groups. Who wants to kick us off? Let's go patient. Patient or
I'd
people
like to start
affected
with
by
the
cancer.
patients.
Yeah.
So after speaking to quite a few of our patients, I think some of the top tips is being open and honest as much as you can. Disclose what you want to disclose. Don't feel forced to disclose anything more. But I think that open and honest policy goes a long way. And yesterday, in fact, I was at a round table at the House of Lords, and they were discussing unpaid carers, and I happened to sit next to somebody who just won a illegal landmark case through an employment appeal because she was dismissed unfairly, and there was no reasonable adjustments put into place. It was like a up and out kind of policy on that company, massive company, but she was open and honest with what she was going through, and then to be kind of treated so poorly, in my opinion, I think went against her. But I would always go with honesty being the best policy, because if your employer doesn't know or is not aware, they can't do anything to change.
And the same for for somebody in my position, as I was, a partner, another half, just be open and honest.
I think so. I have been, and I've been very fortunate to work in the employment that I'm in. But as a carer, I think you again need to share your needs.
And it's worth saying that you mentioned it. There are people out there that aren't going to be supportive and sympathetic, but you've got to remember that you have protections. As Sarita was just saying, somebody who was treated unfairly, not a nice situation to go through, but was ultimately proved correct and won the case. You don't want that ever to happen, which is why we're saying engage and have the conversation. But if it isn't going to work out, problems are going to come at some point. In reality, you've had a cancer diagnosis, things are going to be different. And so approaching it proactively at least gives you some kind of control. Yeah. And I think that's really important when there's so much going on. Yeah. And you've got a lot of things on your side. If things don't quite work out the way that they should, you have protection, and that's important to remember.
And that kind of segues nicely onto the bosses of a company, because I guess a big one for them is creating a culture where that honesty is accepted and welcomed.
Yeah, and I think there's so much work and investment going into creating the right kind of cultures within organisations. There's so much research to show you that your company is going to be more successful and make more money, let's be honest, if you have a culture that is engaging and that people want to work in. So I think, there is an understanding of that. I think my top tip to them is that don't be drawn into what I sometimes maybe a bit unfairly call it sort of ticking boxes exercise.
Yeah.
So you say, we've done the policy,
Yeah.
the policy's there,
Yeah.
you know, we've ticked that box. Don't think of it like that. Think about how you can really support those individuals. So having environments where you can have conversations is how you learn. That's how we learned
Yeah.
what we needed to do. And you have to learn to listen. You know, we all have preconceived ideas when we're talking about these kinds of topics. It's sometimes quite difficult to say, well, I'm going to just clear my mind of that and I'm just going to listen to what people are telling me and see what insights I can take from that, which is going to make this a better organisation to work for. But the number one tip and the biggest challenge we face, and it goes back to the employers, is that you've got to think about every single person in your organisation. Because if you're not addressing that issue at that level, you're not doing as much as you could be doing. And it's actually, we've proven it's relatively straightforward to do. It's not difficult.
Yeah. It's when you were saying that just then, I was thinking, you know, we talked before about, you know, having a cancer policy. It'd be 400 pages long, wouldn't it? Because everybody needs very, very, very different adjustments to, you know, their working life. Or you would struggle to write a policy, wouldn't you, that would, you know, capture everybody's experience.
Yeah, I think that's right. It as we've been talking, you know, there's so much complexity. Everyone is different.
Yeah.
It's absolutely right. You know, we would encourage companies to have a policy of some kind. Make sure your employees know about it, because we talk about it about organisations being cancer aware and cancer supportive.
Yeah.
You know, if everyone's aware, they know this is an issue we can talk about, and we know that the organisation is going to support people around this topic, that's a brilliant foundation upon which, you know, you can make some mistakes and not have everything in place, but that is the solid foundation you want.
That's it, though, isn't it? I don't imagine that anybody going through, whether they're a, you know, partner, a carer, the person with cancer, I don't imagine they expect it to be perfect, but you just want to have the intention to help, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And then if we go on to the third group, you know, we're talking about all of us, I guess, aren't we? We're talking about everybody else, you know, the people that work with, you know, your mate at work has been diagnosed with cancer. What do you do? How do you support them?
Well, I can sort of talk a bit about, you know, I've been at this charity, Cancer Support UK, for 4 years now, and I think one of the biggest lessons I learnt early on, which I've taken all the way through this role, is that you have to listen to each individual, and by listening carefully you can actually connect with them quite quickly. And an example of that would be the one that I often use to explain what I mean is, some people like using the term I've battled cancer or I'm battling cancer, but we know from our own research half of the people don't actually like that and find it has negative connotations. So if when I'm talking to you I hear you, after you've had a diagnosis, use the word battle, I know that's the kind of language through which I can connect with you and resonate with you as we're having the conversation. And it's just little things like that, which actually, if you do that, that's how you can, rather than going in and making an assumption. And a common mistake that people do make is you're trying to make people feel better. You might say something like, I know someone who had a cancer diagnosis and they're doing great now. And it's often the worst thing you can say to someone, as you know. So, you know, it takes you away from putting your foot in it, as it were, and actually just saying, okay, I'm going to come in and not bombard you with sympathy, but have some empathy and try and understand your situation.
It's that active listening, isn't it?
Open-mindedness and trying to understand a little bit.
And what was my favourite statistics, 70% of all cancer patients will have one or more long-term condition. So we're not just talking about the cancer, somebody might be dealing with other conditions as well, but the cancer might be consuming them or making other conditions worse. But listening to exactly what you said, Mark, listening to how somebody talks about their concerns, their issues, their condition, where they are in their stage of their pathway, then you can get a lot of tips from that way.
Yeah.
Active listening, I think, helps.
Yeah.
Let's just finish, Sarita, on what you guys are doing, what work the Alliance is doing to support people in returning to work.
So they're working closely with Mark, for example, and the charity itself and other organisations. Macmillan's got a whole heap of resources as well about returning to work. There is a cancer pledge. I think Mark come across that too. So it's like a movement to try and get people to sign up. When I say people, it's organisations.
Yeah.
To get organisations to sign up. So I'm looking into that to see if we can do something on that. Working with our hospitals to make sure, start from home.
Yeah.
I think the first thing to do is start from home and see how people that have been affected by cancer, when they go back into work, how is it for them? And it's very difficult trying to get lived and live stories because of the impact it might have. Somebody might be having a terrible time returning back to work, but they're still in work. They don't want to say anything against their employer.
Yeah.
So it's how do we find ways to kind of collect some of these real life stories, and not just from stories from people who've left an organisation because of bad treatment.
Yeah.
But we want to try and stop them having bad treatment. So how do we work with them?
And elevate the good stories too, because there will be, as Mark said, loads of good examples of companies and individuals that have gone above and beyond where you'd expect.
It's what does good look like? And I think as a society we can develop what good looks like.
I imagine going back into a hospital after a cancer diagnosis is really difficult.
Yeah.
I imagine that can be really challenging. So you're right to look at home first. I feel like we could talk forever on this. There's so much, isn't there? There's so many things we could talk about. But for now, I'm aware of the time. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been really, really, really interesting.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.